kindly Badger thrust them down on a settle to toast themselves at the fire, and bade them remove their wet coats and boots. Then he fetched them dressing gowns and slippers, and himself bathed the mole's shin with warm water, and mended the cut with sticking plaster, till the whole thing was just as good as new, if not better. In the embracing light and warmth, warm and dry at last, with weary legs propped up in front of them, and a suggestive clink of plates being arranged on the table behind, it seemed to the storm-driven animals, now in safe anchorage, that the cold and trackless wild wood just left outside was miles and miles away, and all that they had suffered in it a half-forgotten dream. When at last they were thoroughly toasted, the Badger summoned them to the table, where he had been busy laying a repast. They had felt pretty hungry before, but when they actually saw at last the supper that was spread before them, it really seemed only a question of what they should attack first, where all was so attractive, and whether the other things would obligingly wait for them till they had time to give them attention. Conversation was impossible for a long time, and when it was slowly resumed, it was that regrettable sort of conversation that results from talking with your mouth full. The Badger did not mind that sort of thing at all, nor did he take any notice of elbows on the table, or everybody speaking at once. As he did not go into society himself, he had got an idea that these things belonged to the things that didn't really matter. We know, of course, that he was wrong and took too narrow view, because they do matter very much, though it would take too long to explain why. He sat in his armchair at the head of the table and nodded gravely at intervals as the animals told their story, and he did not seem surprised or shocked at anything, and he never said, "I told you so," or "just what I always said," or remarked that they ought to have done so-and-so or ought not to have done something else. The mole began to feel very friendly towards him. When supper was really finished at last, and each animal felt that his skin was now as tight as was decently safe, and that by this time he didn't care a hang for anybody or anything, they gathered round the glowing embers of the great wood fire, and thought how jolly it was to be sitting up so late and so independent and so full. And after they had chatted for a time about things in general, the Badger said heartily, "Now then, tell us the news from your part of the world. How's old Toad going on?" "Oh, from bad to worse," said the Rat gravely, while the Mole cocked up on a settle and basking in the firelight, his heels higher than his head, tried to look properly mournful. "Another smash-up only last week, and a bad one. You see, he will insist on driving himself, and he's hopelessly incapable. If he'd only employ a decent, steady, well-trained animal, pay him good wages and leave everything to him, he'd get on all right. But no, he's convinced he's a heaven-born driver, and nobody can teach him anything, and all the rest follows." "How many has he had?" inquired the Badger gloomily. "Smashes or machines?" asked the Rat. "Oh, well, after all, it's the same thing with Toad. This is the 7th. As for the others, you know that coach house of his? Well, it's piled up, literally piled up to the roof with fragments of motor cars, none of them bigger than your hat. That accounts for the other 6, so far as they can be accounted for." "He's been in hospital 3 times, put in the Mole, and as for the fines he's had to pay, it's simply awful to think of." "Yes, and that's part of the trouble," continued the Rat. "Toad's rich, we all know, but he's not a millionaire, and he's hopelessly a bad driver, and quite regardless of the law and order. Killed or ruined, it's got to be one of the two things sooner or later. Badger, we're his friends. Oughtn't we do something?" The Badger went through a bit of hard thinking. "Now look here," he said at last, rather severely. "Of course, you know I can't do anything now." His 2 friends assented, quite understanding his point. No animal, according to the rules of animal etiquette, is ever expected to do anything strenuous or heroic or even moderately active during the off-season of winter. All are sleepy, some actually asleep. All are weather-bound, more or less, and all are resting from arduous days and nights, during which every muscle in them has been severely tested and every energy kept at full stretch. Very well then, continued the Badger, but when once the year has really turned and the nights are shorter and halfway through them one rouses and feels fidgety and wanting to be up and doing by sunrise, if not before, you know. Both animals nodded gravely. They knew. Well then, went on the Badger, we, that is you and me and our friend Mole here, will take Toad seriously in hand. We'll stand no nonsense whatever. We'll bring him back to reason, by force if need be. We'll make him be a sensible Toad. You're asleep, Rat. Not me, said the Rat, waking up with a jerk. He's been asleep 2 or 3 times since supper, said the Mole, laughing. He himself was feeling quite wakeful and even lively, though he did not know why. The reason was, of course, that he being naturally an underground animal by birth and breeding, the situation of Badger's house exactly suited him and made him feel at home, while the Rat, who slept every night in a bedroom, the windows of which opened on a breezy river, naturally felt the atmosphere still and oppressive. Well, it's time we were all in bed, said the Badger, getting up and fetching flat candlesticks. Come along, you two. I'll show you your quarters, and take your time tomorrow morning, breakfast at any hour you please. He conducted the 2 animals to a long room that seemed half bedchamber and half loft. The Badger's winter stores, which indeed were visible everywhere, took up half the room. Piles of apples, turnips and potatoes, baskets full of nuts and jars of honey. But the 2 little white beds on the remainder of the floor looked soft and inviting, and the linen on them, though coarse, was clean and smelt beautifully of lavender. And the Mole and the Water Rat, shaking off their garments in some 30 seconds, tumbled in between the sheets in great joy and contentment. In accordance with the kindly Badger's injunctions, the 2 tired animals came down to breakfast very late the next morning and found a bright fire burning in the kitchen, and 2 young hedgehogs sitting on a bench at the table eating oatmeal porridge out of wooden bowls. The hedgehogs dropped their spoons, rose to their feet and ducked their heads respectfully as the 2 entered. There, sit down, said the Rat pleasantly, and go on with your porridge. Where have you youngsters come from? Lost your way in the snow, I suppose? Yes, please, sir, said the elder of the 2 hedgehogs respectfully. Me and little Billy here, we was trying to find our way to school. Mother would have us go. Was the weather ever so? And of course we lost ourselves, sir, and Billy he got frightened and took and cried, being young and faint-hearted. At last we happened up against Mr. Badger's back door and made so bold as to knock, sir, for Mr. Badger, he's a kind-hearted gentleman, as everyone knows. I understand, said the Rat, cutting himself some rashers from a side of bacon, while the Mole dropped some eggs into a saucepan. And what's the weather like outside? You needn't sir me quite so much, he added. Oh, terrible bad, sir, terrible deep the snow is, said the hedgehog. No getting out for the likes of you gentlemen to-day. Where's Mr. Badger? Inquired the Mole as he warmed the coffee pot before the fire. The master's gone into his study, sir, replied the hedgehog, and he said as how he was going to be particular busy this morning, and on no account was he to be disturbed. This explanation, of course, was thoroughly understood by everyone present. The fact is, as already set forth, when you live a life of intense activity for 6 months of the year, and a comparative or actual somnolence for the other 6, during the latter period you cannot be continually pleading sleepiness when there are people about or things to be done. The excuse gets monotonous. The animals well knew that Badger, having eaten a hearty breakfast, had retired to his study and settled himself in an armchair with his legs up on another and a red cotton handkerchief over his face, and was being busy in the usual way at this time of the year. The front doorbell clanged loudly, and the Rat, who was very greasy with buttered toast, sent Billy, the smaller hedgehog, to see who it might be. There was a sound of much stamping in the hall, and presently Billy returned in front of the otter, who threw himself on the rat with an embrace and a shout of affectionate greeting. "Get off!" spluttered the rat with his mouth full.